The first load of charcoal went into the ground on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday the whole valley knew, because Cletus Pruitt had driven past and seen a grown man on his knees in a dead field, raking black dust into a trench like he was burying something he was ashamed of. 200 acres of playing dead, Cletus said down at the co-op, and Harlan's boy comes home from the city to bury barbecue in it. That family. Lord. They laughed. Not cruel, most of them. The soft laugh you give a thing you've decided is finished. Owen Toole heard about it the way you hear about weather, second-hand, and too late to change. He kept digging. Every expert had said the same word. 3 of them, in 3 different seasons, standing on the same cracked ground with the same clipboard face. Unworkable. The county agronomist had put it in writing. The soil lab had put a number on it that meant the same thing. The man from the big farm management outfit had not even walked the far quarter. He'd looked at the near 40, towed the grey hardpan where nothing grew but foxtail, and the salt bloom came up white as frost in July, and told Owen the kindest thing he could do for himself was sign the land over and take the cheque. But what none of them knew was what Owen had read in a library book 3 states away. In the worst month of his life, when he had nothing left to lose but a farm he hadn't set foot on in 11 years. He was 38. He had left at 27 with a degree and a grudge, sworn he'd never scrape a living out of dirt the way his father had, and for 11 years he'd worn a badge on a lanyard and sat in a grey building and been, by every measure the town understood, a success. Then the company folded, and the marriage folded a season behind it, and the badge stopped opening the door, and Owen Tull drove back into the valley at 38, with everything he owned in a truck bed, and a shame in his chest like a swallowed stone. His father was 2 years dead. The land had come to him the way a debt comes to you, because there was no one else. He'd meant to sell it. He'd walked out onto the near 40 that first evening meaning to price it, and he'd stood on the grey hardpan where his father had broken his health, and he'd felt the old man's disappointment come up out of the ground through his shoes. His father had left him one thing besides the land, a wooden box on the kitchen table, and in it the small tools of a life, and a note. In the blunt pencil hand Owen would have known anywhere. Just a line. His father was not a man of many. Dirt's not dead. It's just hungry. And nobody around here ever learnt to feed it. Owen had read that line and gone cold, because he'd spent 11 years being fed by a company that dropped him the day he stopped being useful, and he understood hunger from the wrong end of it now. He put the note in his shirt pocket. It stayed there through everything that came after, soft as cloth at the folds. The book came later, from the county library, on a night he couldn't sleep. A thin, dull book about old dirt in a faraway jungle. Soil that should have been poor and wasn't. Black earth that farmers had built 2,000 years ago, and that still grew crops, when the red clay around it grew nothing. They'd done it with fire. With charcoal, worked into the ground by the ton. Char that held water and held life, the way the dead grey hardpan of the Tull place held neither. The book had a word for it Owen couldn't pronounce. His father had a shorter one. Feed it. There was no magic in it and no money in it fast, and that was exactly what made the town so sure he'd lost his mind. Because the method took years, and it took work no reasonable man would do for free, and it took burying money in ground 3 specialists had signed off as a grave. Owen had no money to bury. What he had was waste, and the whole valley was choking on it. The sawmill up the river paid to haul off its slabwood and bark. The orchard burned its prunings every fall, and hated the smoke and the fire marshal both. The road crew ground stumps into piles nobody wanted. Owen drove to each of them, hat in hand, the returned failure asking for their garbage. And every one of them said yes, relieved, thinking he was a fool, and glad to hand a fool their problem. He built a long earthen kiln in the pit behind the barn, the low-oxygen way the book described, and he learned by ruining 3 batches how to burn wood so it turned to char instead of ash, the difference between feeding the soil and just scorching it. The kiln ran through the fall and into the cold. Owen worked it in the dark after the day's other work, and the neighbours saw the red glow low in the pit and the black smoke, and made of it what small towns make of a light that burns too late. Ada Finch, who kept bees on the ridge and missed nothing, told the church circle that Harlan Tull's boy had come home to burn the place down slow. She said it worried, not mean. That was the thing about the valley. They watched him the way you watch someone you're afraid is drowning. From the bank, doing nothing. Certain, the named doubter drove a clean truck and held Owen's paper. Merle Vance ran the ag lending desk at the Valley Bank, and he had known Owen's father, and he came out in the spring with a face already made up. He didn't get down in the trench. He stood at the top of it and looked at the black streaks Owen had worked into the near 40 over the winter. 40 tons of char raked and deseed and watered into ground that still, to any honest eye, grew nothing. "Owen, I'll be straight, on account of I knew Harlan," Merle said. "You're spending labour you can't get back on ground that's rated 0. I've got a buyer standing who'll take all 200 at a fair number. You could start over somewhere. Nobody'd blame you." "I'm not starting over," Owen said. "I'm finishing something." "Finishing what?" "There's nothing here." "Not yet." Owen wiped his hands on his jeans. "Give me 2 seasons, Merle. Don't call the note for 2 seasons. "That's all I'm asking." Merle looked at the black field a long moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't unkindness, it was pity, which cuts worse. 2 seasons, he said, like a man agreeing to watch a friend try to fly. "But I have to report it as impaired. That's the account, not me." He got back in his clean truck and drove out careful of the ruts. Owen watched him go and took his father's note out of his shirt pocket and read it, though he knew it by heart. Dirt's not dead. It's just hungry. Then he coined the thing he'd tell himself for 2 years, quiet, into the empty field, because a man alone needs a line to hold to. You can't rush a thing back to life. You can only stop starving it and wait for it to remember. He said it, and he went back to the char. The setback came in the second summer, and it came the way the worst of it comes on a farm, not from the enemy you're braced for, but from the thing you love. By then, Owen had charred and buried the near 40 and the middle quarter both, better than 100 acres, and on the first field, the one he'd fed the winter he came home. He'd planted a cover of clover and rye that spring to see, at last, whether any of it had worked. And it had. It came up green. After 11 years gone, and 2 years of char and a father's ghost in his shoes, Owen Tull stood one June morning and looked at green growing where the salt bloom used to whiten, and he got down on his knees in it and put his face in it and breathed. 9 days later, the well went dry. Not the drinking well. The irrigation well. The one his father had drilled. The one Owen had been leaning on to carry the young growth through the dry weeks, while the char was still learning to hold water. It sanded up and quit in the middle of the worst heat the valley had seen in a decade. And the forecast showed nothing but more of it. 3 weeks of it. A killing dry that would take the green back to grey and prove every specialist right in front of the whole county. Owen worked 2 days trying to bring the well back and could not. On the second night he sat on the tailgate in the dark at the edge of his one green field, watching it, unable to water it, and the line came back to him inside out. You can't rush a thing back to life. No, and you couldn't save it, either, when the water quit. He'd fed the dirt and taught it to want to live, and now he was going to stand here and watch it die of thirst because he'd bet everything on charcoal and a dead man's pencil note. 38. twice failed, and about to fail at the one thing his father had asked of him from the grave. He put the note back in his pocket and did not sleep. The dry came on schedule. 3 weeks of it, hard and white-skied, the valley's crops curling. The Pruitt place across the road, good ground, rain-fed corn, went pale and then grey, and then rattled in the wind. And Owen, with no water and nothing left to do, walked his green field every morning the way you sit with someone in a hospital, to be there for the end. The end did not come. The char held. That was the whole plain miracle of it, and there was no magic in it at all. It was physics. The same physics from the dull library book. The buried carbon holding rain and dew in its million tiny rooms, and letting the ground drink slow from its own reserve while the naked fields around it burned. The clover on Owen's first field stayed green through a drought that greyed every rain-fed acre for miles. Not lush, but alive. Living, on ground rated 0, through 3 weeks that killed good dirt on every side of it. The land had remembered. It had only needed somebody to stop starving it, and then a hard enough test to show the difference in front of witnesses. And there were witnesses, because a green field in a brown drought is the loudest thing in a county. Cletus Pruitt came first, across the road from his own dying corn, and stood at the fence where a year ago he'd laughed, and looked at the green, and took his cap off. Ada Finch drove her bees down off the ridge to work the one clover bloom left in the valley, and told the church circle a different story now. And Merle Vance came out in his clean truck before his 2 seasons were even up, and this time he got down in the field, and he crouched and pushed his fingers into black crumb soil that a lab had called a grave, soil that came up dark and damp and smelling of living things in the middle of the worst drought in 10 years, and he did not say anything at all for a long while. The verdict, when it came from the same lab that had condemned the ground. Owen sent new samples off the fed fields at the end of that summer. Plain, no note, just dirt in a box. The number that came back was not a number the specialists had believed the ground could reach in a decade, let alone 2 years organic matter up off the floor, the salt driven down, the hard pan opening, water holding better than half the good ground in the township. The lab man drove out himself to see the field that had produced it, the way Owen's book had said men once travelled to see the black earth in the jungle. He stood on the near 40 a long time. I put unworkable on this in writing, he said finally. Both of us signed it. You read it right, Owen said. It was unworkable. It was just hungry too. Nobody around here ever learned to feed it. His father's words, in Owen's mouth, plain as pencil. The money, when it came the slow, honest way, and never once looked like a lottery. There was no buyer waving a fortune. There was a seed and forage company that leased Owen's now living acres to grow certified cover crop and drought trial forage, paying by the acre, year on year, more as more of the 200 came alive. There was the char itself, because every farmer in the valley who'd watched Owen's field stay green through the dry now wanted his ground fed the same way, and Owen had the kiln and the sawmill's waste, and 2 years' hard knowledge of how to burn it right. He built it into a small business off the barn, char by the ton, sold to his neighbours and delivered on his father's flatbed. And he hired the Pruitt boy and then 2 more to run the kilns. Valley kids who'd have gone to the city the way Owen once had. The figures, added up across the leases and the char sales, ran to the low 6 figures a year within 3 seasons, every dollar of it traceable to a load of waste wood and a trench. Nothing you couldn't show a banker and watch him do the sum himself. Which is what Owen did. He went to the valley bank and sat across from Merle Vance and laid it out, and he watched Merle read it and go quiet, and he said not one word about the pity in the truck. When Merle was done, he took off his glasses and looked older. I called it impaired, he said. I had to. But I could have believed you and still done my job. I chose the one that let me off the hook. You gave me the 2 seasons, Owen said. Most wouldn't have. That's a thin thing to hang a man's dignity on. It held anyway. Owen slid a paper across the desk, not the leases. A proposal. I want to fund CHAR for the whole valley. Merley, small loans, farmer to farmer, ground built back 1 field at a time. I need a bank that knows the families for that. I'd rather it be this one. He let it sit. You want back in on this account. It's here. I'd just as soon it stayed in the valley. Merle Vance signed on. It was the best paper his desk wrote in 20 years, and both men knew whose ground it grew out of. That was the summer the drought broke everyone but Owen. By the following spring the valley had a name for what he did that wasn't a joke anymore, and the co-op where Cletus Pruitt had first laughed kept a jar of Owen's CHAR on the counter by the register, black and light and strange, and men who'd sworn the tool place was a grave picked it up and turned it over in their hands, and asked, careful, how a fellow might get started. Owen kept his father's wooden box on the kitchen table where it had waited for him, and the pencil note lived in it now, unfolded flat under the glass so the creases wouldn't wear through. Some evenings he walked the near 40 at last light, the old salt ground gone dark and soft and green, and he'd take up a handful and let it fall, black crumb through his fingers, and he'd say the line his father never got to hear come true. You can't rush a thing back to life. You can only stop starving it and wait for it to remember. The dirt had remembered. It had only ever been hungry. And the son who came home a failure had learned, 2 years too late for his father, and just in time for the land, the one thing the old man left him: how to feed it. If you've ever kept working at something everyone around you had already given up on, tell us about it in the comments. We read them. The moral sits as plain as the ground it grew from. What the experts call dead is often only starved, and what the reasonable people call waste is often the exact thing that brings it back. Feeding a hungry thing takes years and looks like folly the whole way through, right up until the season that proves you were the only one who understood. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and about the person who taught you that a thing worth saving is worth waiting for. If this reached you, pass it to someone who's standing on ground they've been told to walk away from. And whatever hard, grey field you're feeding in the dark right now, may your patience outlast the drought. May the soil under your hands remember, and may you live to see the green come up where they swore nothing ever could.